Hey guys, thank you for joining me here at Complete in Christ. Well, today we're going to start a new book. We're going to take over the next probably several months, and we're going to walk through the book of Jonah. The book of Jonah is nestled in the pages of what's known as the Minor Prophets. And when you say Minor Prophets, why is it called a Minor Prophet? Minor Prophets are usually books that are very small. It has the word minor has nothing to do with the message. It's a major message in a very small book. I love the book of Jonah. Oftentimes, as I read through the book of Jonah, the Lord reminds me of and uses Jonah to remind me of myself. And oftentimes, how I've been rebellious. I didn't want to do what God was asking of me. And as I go through life, what I begin to realize is there's a lot of people just like me. As I think about the book of Jonah, it's the very first book, if I remember correctly, it's the very first book as a pastor that I taught through verse by verse. Did that probably in the mid-1980s, and the Lord really used this book to speak into my life and to speak to my heart. I think the last time that I walked through the book of Jonah with a group of people was in 2002. So it's been a while since I've walked through and taught through the book of Jonah. And I look forward to how God's going to use it in my life, and I pray that He'll use it in your life. So today I want us to look at verses 1 and 2 of the book of Jonah. And this is what it says. It says, "The word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, Arise and go to Nineveh, the great city, and cry out against it, for their wickedness has come up before me." So we see that God spoke to Jonah. It says the word of the Lord came to Jonah. God spoke to Jonah. It doesn't tell us exactly how He did it. My thinking would be that probably somehow in a small, still voice that God got Jonah's attention. But Jonah understood God's call on his life. Jonah understood what God was asking of him. You see, and it says Jonah was the son of Amittai. See, Jonah was a real person. This is a true story. This really, really happened. There's a lot of people who tell you that what happened in the book of Jonah could not have happened. Oh, yes, it did. Jonah was a real guy. And that God spoke to Jonah and He called him to a specific task. What God said to Jonah was very, very clear. The call was clear. And He told him exactly where He wanted him to go and exactly what he needed to do. That's what we see in the first two verses. It says, the word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai. Then He said this. He says, you arise and you go to Nineveh, the great city, and you cry out against it. Why? Because their wickedness has come up before me. You see, God is telling Jonah to go to Nineveh and to proclaim truth, to stand up and to cry out against what was going on in this great city. We see in Jonah chapter 4 verse 11 that 120,000 people repented. So we know that there was at least 120,000, and more than likely that's speaking of only the men. And in preparation for this and studying this, I found that some people think there were over 500,000 people that lived in Nineveh. Maybe as many as 600,000 people that lived there. And God says, Jonah, I want you to go to Nineveh, this great city, and I want you to cry out. There's some things I want you to say. I want you to cry out against their wickedness. I want you to call it out. I want you to address their wickedness by name. They're living in a way that's not pleasing to me. They're evil and they're wicked, and I'm calling you to go to Nineveh and cry out against them and the way that they're living. But there's a problem here. Jonah didn't want to go. Why? Because Jonah did not like the Ninevites. Jonah had been raised and reared to not like those people. You see, they were not his people. He did not like them. He did not want to go to Nineveh. He did not like what God told him. So I want to share with you in closing today just some facts about God's call. God's call on Jonah and God's call on my life. You see, not always is the call what we want to hear. Jonah didn't want to go to Nineveh. He didn't like those people. He did not like what God was asking of him. But God does not have to get my permission or your permission. He did not have to get Jonah's permission in order to tell him what he wanted to do and how he wanted to use him. Number two, the second fact is that God's call has directions. You see, Jonah knew what God was asking of him. You know, in my life and your life, when God calls, when God speaks, we know. Sometimes we don't know the details of the direction until after we take the first step of obedience, but God sometimes tells us the directions up front. But when God calls, He gives directions. And sometimes those directions are not what we want. The third thing is this, is that sometimes we don't always understand the call. You know, I'm thinking Jonah was probably, what was going through his head is, why me? You know I don't like those folks. You know, there's been many times in my life where God has spoken to me, or God has called me to speak a certain word, or to do certain things where I'm thinking, God, why me? There's somebody else more capable. There's somebody else that's probably waiting on this opportunity. Why are you choosing me? Sometimes we just don't understand what God is up to because we don't see the bigger picture. And the last thing I would say is this, is that it does not pay not to heed His call. When God speaks, it does not pay for me to disobey God's call on my life. You know, yes, the price of obedience is costly. And it's one of the things that we learn through life, through walking with Jesus, is that it costs us as followers of Jesus to obey truth, to obey the Word of God, and to obey God's call on our life. But it always costs us more to disobey. Disobedience will always cost me more in the long run than obedience. And Jonah finds that out. You know, so when we look at the book of Jonah, what we see is that God's wanting to get a word to a group of people that desperately needs to hear it. Jonah didn't like those people, so Jonah didn't want to go. Jonah understood the direction, but he didn't want to go there. God spoke to Jonah and He said, go to Nineveh. There's a call on Jonah's life to go and speak truth to the Ninevites. What's the call on your life? What's the call on my life? And am I willing to obey God's call? It never pays to disobey God's call on my life. I hope you have a blessed day. Hope you walk with Jesus today. Be listening for God to speak to you. And when He speaks, obey. Have a blessed day and let Jesus be Jesus in you today. Thank you so much for watching Complete in Christ as we strive to teach you about the Christ life. And we encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel, and may you have a blessed day walking with Jesus.